I think the fact that I've been talking about Egypt for a long time is now seeping into the wrong side of information, giving off this idea again that ancient Egypt is the most ancient in Africa. But I want to remind you that ancient Egypt, though it was the most impressive place in Africa, is not the most ancient. It's not the most ancient civilization, not the most ancient organization. It's not the oldest place where you find cattle. It's not the oldest place where you find people planting. And it's not the most oldest place where you find special ideas. And I'll explain that later. The reason why it's important to state the other places in Africa is because it gives perspective, not only to Egypt, but to Africa itself. If we look at the Enedi Plateau, we can see that it dates back from 5000 BC, going all the way back to about 8000 BC. But it's not just that. It's the fact that we can see camels and we can see cattle on the walls. These mushroom-styled humans, which would lead some to some wild ideas, though understandable, show us that these people were fully alive and their civilization had already begun. Their structures may have fell. They might have even been built on something like wood or straw, but that doesn't matter. What really matters is why here? The more scientists investigate, the more these caves start to make sense. Year after year, starting from about 2016, they have been gathering more and more evidence to show that within Africa things were growing. And as we can see here, from 2021 indicates that an archaeozoological discovery made at Aferd turned out to be a great importance for the history of the entire of cattle on the African continent. A large skull fragment and nearly complete horn core of an oryx, a wild ancestor of domestic cattle, were discovered at the site dating back 50,000 years ago and associated with MSA. These are the oldest remains of the oryx in Sudan, and they also mark the southernmost range of this species in the world. Based on the cattle boss, remains found at Alfred and Letty indicates that it is justified to raise again the issue of the origin of the cattle in northeast Africa. The idea of domestic cattle in Africa coming from the Fertile Crescent exclusively is now seeming as having serious shortcomings. In 2025, would further conclude and present similar findings to the previous reports based on osteometric data from the Leti Desert in Sudan. The managing of Barbary sheep may be viewed as parallel evidence for the domestication of cattle amid the early period of the Holocene near Naphtalier in the Western Desert. Between the 11th millennium BP and the 10th millennium BP, semi-sedentary African hunter-gatherers may have independently domesticated cattle as a form of reliable food source and as a short-term adaptation to the dry period of the Green Sahara, which resulted in a limited availability of edible flora. Oryx fossils, which have been dated between the 11th millennium BP and the 10th millennium BP, have been found at Bur, Kaseba, and Naphtalier. The earliest evidence of domesticated cattle from the Central Sahara dates, however, to the 8th millennium before the present, which is 5000 BC, really 6000 BC. Now, I want to state something. It doesn't only make it clear that the thing that falls in dispute is the thing about animals, sheep, cattle, and where they must have come from. And of course, there were so many other wild animals that we domesticated, but we didn't change them like we did the cattle. And so, if you let them free, they just go back in the wild. Like lions, for example, warriors would be seen traveling with them, as they do today with some owners of reserves, where lions are raised as children and operate with the owner, but can also go back into the wild. If we look at this picture here, we can see that there is a similarity in the way that the camel riders ride the camels. The saddle is considered the North African saddle. Really, it's a African saddle, of how they ride the camels and how they used to use them for war. The camel, in essence, is an African horse. Let's talk about acquisition. So we can see here that we have two African cave art. One is dating to an earlier date and one later. What we see here is a man riding a horse, and on the other side, we see a man riding a camel. These two are both deep in Africa. This one is from the Niger regions, the horse, and this one is from central North Africa, the Enedi Plateau. What is a horse doing this close in sub-Saharan Africa? Why is it here? Well, unlike the ancient Egyptians who did not adopt the camel until way later, the Africans adopted whatever new idea would come. And we know that in Mesopotamia around 3000 BC, horses were utilized. But this did not stop there. By 1200 BC, horses would be used in Africa both for riding and also for chariots later. But why is this important to understand? Well, it's important to understand for a couple reasons. Because it shows that ancient Egypt had access to these areas. Maybe not the fullest, but it had access. But more importantly, is that people like the people from the land of Punt, people like people from Sudan, had more access to these people and also to the Egyptians. Which makes you think, why don't those people look more developed than the ancient Egyptians? They had access to the most civilized nations in the world. Think about it. The most civilized civilization in the world, ancient Egypt. And then at the same time, you have access to Niger, you have access to the land of Punt. That would make your civilization jump by 100. Sometimes I want to just grab what everybody knows about Africa and just pull it out of the ground from its root so we can rewrite the history. As you can see here, we have from Mauritania a depiction of a horse. I'm not going to read this whole thing, you can relax, but I just want to show you that some of the oldest dating in the Sahara, including Mauritania, are from about the second millennium BC, depicting horses mixed with the art of Africa with these two triangles. These two triangles, if the symbols are similar to what they would later mean, that touching like that usually means male and female, meaning a union. Now, it's possible that those triangles have nothing to do with their culture, but it's very interesting to look at. Let's return to naming schemes. These words that we see today that are modern names given by both colonial and post colonial civilizations. Names like Mozambique, Zambia, Chad, Niger, they're interesting, but because of what we know, because of the history of Africa, we can now restate or replace these words exactly where they were back in the day. For example, the Sudan areas, we can easily call it the Kush areas. And then right next to them, we can call this place Punt. Now, I want to remind you that the reason why they called those languages Cushitic languages is because they had a similar, the languages that are in the area of Ethiopia and Sudan. The reason why they call them Cushitic is because they believe that they have a similarity to the kingdom of Kush. And I think it's very important to remember that fact. If we were to go a little left to Chad, we have the Sao civilization, SAO civilization. Then, of course, in Niger and Mali, the names become lost again. And in North Africa, we can have all kinds of names if we want. Libya is a name that was invented by the Greeks and they wrote it in the ancient Egyptian language. So I want to spend the next few moments talking about the so-called Fertile Crescent. Now, this Fertile Crescent, as you can see, starts about Mesopotamia and the Sumerian areas and the Elamite areas, and it heads all the way to Israel and to about Turkey. Now, what is the problem with this word, the Fertile Crescent? We're going to start with words before we go back to 10,000 BC and compare the histories. Implied in the name, the Fertile Crescent, is that there was something special about this area of the Middle East. Unfortunately, for a lot of people, it's not true. You see, there's something called Green Arabia. As much as we have the Green Sahara, Arabia was also green, and we can see animal marks or animal bones left over in Arabia because Arabia, just like the Sahara, changed due to climate over the years. And so this fertile crescent, which is supposed to limit the development of the civilization, doesn't make sense given the fact that all of Arabia at one point had patches of green. Without that limiting factor, there is no need for the Fertile Crescent to only be limited to the so called Fertile Crescent. It's about 4000 BC that the entire region becomes desert and it becomes virtually uninhabitable without using specific ways in order to survive. And so the people there must have been geniuses at living in the desert. Now, here's a second problem. It's about 10,000 BP or BC, if you'd like, that the people start having a giant change in lifestyle. But as we saw with Africa, that's about the same time that the Africans have a giant change in lifestyle. Now, the change was still gradual. It's not bang, they suddenly have buildings. Those won't come for a long time. Instead, what we see is the same as in Africa, where we see wood and clay and some early ideas that we are going to get this. Now, of course, we have Anatolia or we have the Turkish regions where we see the earliest civilization known to man at this point, which is Göbekli Tepe. Now, I want to make sure that you guys do understand the full extent of the Fertile Crescent. All these names that are depicted here are very important. not only for its own self, but also because we can learn something from the people who discovered and used things back in the day. For example, we find these, I guess, pottery stone in Ali Kosh. Ali Kosh being at the bottom, which would probably be the Elamite areas later on, but at this period, it's a completely different entire civilization. And this civilization is so early that we start to see the earliest domestication of sheep and cattle in this region about 7,500 BC, though we know that about 8.5 thousand BC, that's like the earliest we can find there where there are some animals that are being tamed. Now, I want to remind you that as early as this is about as early as you see them in Africa. And I don't just mean on site, I mean we see them that early being captured and we see them that early being used. It may seem like this fertile crescent that they're talking about is supposed to be special in this way, but again, we find ourselves in a difficult position because India, we find clay pots dating to about the same date. So, of course, let's just pick various periods in history. We're going to pick about 4000 BC or 6000 BP, depending on how you want to write it. So, this is pre dynastic Egypt, the Ubaid period of the Fertile Crescent, and the Indus, or the beginning of the Indus civilization. As you can see, these are three great civilizations, but they do appear a bit later than some of those other ones like Göbekli Tepe. Now, what's very interesting is analyzing their pottery. Now, you would expect that if they grew out of the same ooze, they would have the same pottery that's built the same way and exists in the same exact manner. Is that what we see? Not exactly. While if we go back for a few years before this, the techniques are different, but the answer is about the same. We see the clay, which is just like a very basic jar with very simple shape and probably a very circular shape. We can see that once they establish themselves as kingdoms, what you'll notice about the typical Mesopotamian artwork is that it sort of has a basket look about it. It's almost like when you weave baskets together, you can start to see the, I don't know, the way it looks is just different. Then when you look at the Indian one, it's smoother, and of course it's very different in the way that it's built, though having similarities of its own. In ancient Egypt, unlike the others, it's actually less decorated. The people of ancient Egypt, you would expect to have these elaborate ones like the one we see from the Indus Valley right now, is sort of a cross between the Mesopotamian and the others. But look at the ones in the pre dynastic period of ancient Egypt. They are exactly the same as the ones found in Nubia, utilized by these people. And this is from lower, upper, no matter where you go in Egypt, you will find these jars everywhere. Now, why would I show these three side by side? Well, I want to draw similarity between these. You can see that technologically they're at the same thinking, they're at the same place. They've got the same mindset in that they're already working with pottery, agriculture, they have civilization, already written in their DNA, and they're going to go down that direction. But those similarities are very limited. They're so far away from each other, not just physically, but in thinking as well. The ancient Egyptian one is very directional, meaning it's very African in its origin. It's very, why that shape? Why that color? Of course, there's a real physical reason to it, because, of course, the method that they use to build this, which is by hand, oh, by the way, all three of these are built by hand, but which is by hand, it's about later in about 3000 BC that we start seeing the potter's wheel coming up. But you can see that they have their own complete styles. And if we bring it back to an even older date, not only is it built by hand, but it's also built with a certain thought in mind. You can see that the base is smaller than the top, which is something that you'll actually see in all three of those. I mean, you can still see it in the ancient Egyptian one where the pot is sort of clung like very sharp at the bottom. But let's see the versions of these. When looking at any other place in history, it's easy to imagine that this general shape would have been taken into consideration by almost anyone who made pottery. And when we look at different pots, even if they're not complete, they seem to have the shape in mind. Now, keep in mind the reason why you'd probably have this shape is so that you can still be able to carry it, but carry the most amount of whatever you want to put inside of this type of container. If it was square shape, it probably wouldn't be able to carry so easily. If it was completely oval, you would have the same problem. But if you made it too thin, then it will be a waste because, of course, there won't be enough space to put things in. So clearly, this is a shape that a lot of them came up with. Now, there's some people who talk about how even during this period, there probably was the most limited amount of trade between even these three nations. Some people use this not so common style of ancient Egyptian pottery to indicate that actually they have a Mesopotamian origin. So the blacktop red clay being of Sudanese origin, but this type being of Mesopotamian origin. Now, I have two things to say for this. One, let's pretend that it does, right? So, it's just trade. What does that say about the civilization? But you can see that in the way that they're built, there is an obvious continuity between the red clay topped black pottery. It's easy to see that it's continuous in its shape, in its design. It's just painted different. And also, it doesn't have the truly basket style, almost pointing. If you look at the Mesopotamian art, it's almost pointing in a direction, perhaps mimicking the styles of baskets when they're stretched because of the way they look. But again, that's just my interpretation, the way I look at it. I don't think anybody else believes that. But I do see, in my opinion, that there is this stretched look about them. Anyway, like, share, subscribe. I'll again have to make a video on the Afro-Asiatic languages and remind us that of these three great civilizations, only one of them had it in this period.